What is Sama's story with the demons? Today, I will take you to Yemen, specifically to Taiz Governorate. We've heard about adventurers and challenges, about people entering mountains or caves that are said to be haunted by demons, and others entering houses that are claimed to be haunted and filming them. Let's hear Sama's story and what happened to him. But before I start the story, I ask for your support by hitting like and subscribing to the channel. And don't forget to share the video with your friends. Sama says, I am a young man from Taiz Governorate in Yemen, unemployed, and I enjoy staying up late with my friends. I sleep all day, and at night I stay up with my friends. My father was the one who provided for us, and he worked in a private company. One night, while I was with my friends, we were sitting together, talking and chatting. The young men began talking about a village in Taiz that was abandoned by its residents due to demons. They started showing videos on their phones, talking about how the people of the mountain village left their homes because of the demons. I stood up and said jokingly, "What demons and what nonsense? These are just stories and tales with no basis in truth. The people who left the village probably made up this story to gain views or stir up controversy." I was mocking the talk about these matters, but there was a young man among us who was from that village. When he heard my words, he got angry and said to me, "Do you think they're lying?" I said, "Even if you're angry, I'll tell you, if demons were really like you say, why didn't they go to the owners of the villas and palaces? Why are they driving out the residents of a simple mountain village?" The young man became angry at my words and said, "Sama, if you don't believe the story about the demons, I'll give you a challenge." He then took out his gun and said, "If you can spend one night in the village without hearing or seeing anything, and you can film yourself all night, the gun will be yours." Sama says, "When I saw the gun, I became greedy for it. It was worth about $3,000, and I desperately needed the money. I thought it was just empty talk, so I decided to accept the challenge." So, a challenge was set between me and him, and also among the young men who were present, as they got excited about the idea of me entering this abandoned village, which sits at the top of the mountain, because of the stories about demons. We agreed on the challenge, and I said to the young men present, "Witness to his words, if I spend an entire night in this village, I'll get his gun." He replied, "No need for witnesses. I'll leave my gun as a trust with Ali, one of the young men with us. Tomorrow I'll come by with my car, take you and the others, and we'll take you up the mountain." I was very excited about this, and the young men were excited too. So we agreed that he would pick me up the next day, along with some of the others, and we would go to the mountain. Indeed, the night passed quietly, and I slept deeply without any worry. The next day I had my lunch and everything seemed fine. We had agreed that he would pick me up at 3:30 p.m. And indeed, no sooner had a few moments passed than he arrived with his car. I got in with them and we set off towards the mountain. When we reached the mountain, we discovered that the car couldn't ascend due to the roughness of the road. So we all got out of the car and the agreement was renewed. I had my mobile phone with me to film everything throughout the night. I asked them to prepare a flashlight and food for me, as I was desperate for both. When we arrived, they got me the flashlight and food, and everyone was saying, "Sama, make sure you'll spend this night." I laughed and said confidently, "Wait, you'll see that everything you're talking about is just nonsense. I remember it was around 3:30 p.m. Before I started climbing, one of the young men said to me, "Be careful." I laughed and said, "My heart is made of steel, don't worry." I started climbing, and it took about an hour and a half to reach the village. The mountain was very steep, and the village was at its peak. In Yemen, we have many villages located on the slopes of mountains, and their residents are used to climbing and descending daily. When I arrived, the time was nearly 5 in the afternoon, just before sunset. I found the village in front of me, completely abandoned. The houses, about 50 in total, were silent with an eerie stillness. Imagine yourself alone in this place, looking at the shattered windows and doors that the villagers had taken with them. There was also a small abandoned mosque, and the houses were very close to one another. I started wandering among these houses, and the feeling of fear and discomfort began to creep in. Imagine yourself alone in such a place, but the challenge and the greed for the $3,000 gun kept me determined to stay. I entered one of the houses and climbed onto its roof. The house was made of mud, consisting of 2 floors, and it was the largest house in the village. I sat on the roof, where I could see the entire village. The place grew quieter and quieter, and the day started to get darker. As the sun set, or shortly after, I decided to have my dinner that I had brought with me. I sat down and began eating, sipping on some soft drinks I had with me. While I was enjoying my time, suddenly, I noticed 2 women walking between the houses, carrying bundles of wood on their heads. They were walking calmly between the houses. I looked at them, astonished, and thought to myself, how can they say the village is abandoned? They must be lying. There are still people living here. I followed the women until they entered one of the houses, but I didn't think much of it. I continued with my dinner and stayed where I was. As time passed, the darkness began to cover the place, and complete silence took over. I was alone in this village, but the weather was really nice, and I hadn't seen anything scary. I was thinking about the gun and the money, and everything seemed fine. While I was looking at the houses, I noticed that some of them had a faint light, as though there was a small flame burning inside them. I started to hear the sounds of children laughing and the bleating of sheep, and I thought to myself, there are no demons here, and the gun will be mine. I'll prove to them that the village still has inhabitants, and that what they said was just nonsense. I continued sitting in my place until midnight. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a child crying, coming from the house next to the one I was sitting on the roof of. The crying was clear and very loud. I looked at the house, which had no windows or doors, but I saw a faint light inside. I hesitated to intervene or get closer to the house, afraid that something might happen, or someone might ask me, "Why are you here?" I didn't care much and decided to stay where I was. After that, I saw from afar a flame of fire being carried by someone moving between the houses. Then I began to hear sounds of singing, music, and drums. I thought, maybe they're having a wedding or some kind of celebration. I couldn't see anything due to the houses obstructing my view from the roof, so I decided to go down. As I was coming down from the roof, lighting my way with the flashlight, I suddenly saw a half-naked child in front of me, with black skin, as if he were from Africa. He looked very strange, and he stood at the bottom of the stairs while I stood at the top. When I directed the light towards him, I felt fear and asked him, "Boy, what's your name? What brought you here?" But he stepped back and suddenly ran away, and I didn't know where he went. Despite my astonishment at the child and his appearance, I decided to walk around the village, looking for people to talk to and spend the night with. I was convinced that my friends had been wrong when they said the village was abandoned. I began walking between the houses, and you can imagine the strange heat I felt in the place, even though the weather had been cold and pleasant when I was on the roof. The heat I felt was not natural at all. He says, I was walking towards the large fire until I reached it. There, I saw a group of people and children sitting around the fire, singing and dancing. At first I thought it was just a regular celebration, and I couldn't hear their voices clearly. I entered among them without asking for permission and sat observing them. They seemed normal, but I noticed that their heads felt large and rough, not smooth, very coarse like African hair, and none of them had short hair. I sat among them, watching what was happening. There was someone playing the flute, and the tunes were so beautiful that I became completely absorbed in them. Suddenly, I saw the little child I had seen earlier, but this time he was wearing clothes and he was standing facing me, staring at me without moving his eyes. I smiled at him and said, "Come here." But he didn't move. He just kept staring at me like a statue. I decided to ignore him and turn my face away, and suddenly 2 of the people stood up and moved towards the fire. They began to dance in a very strange way, something I had never seen before. They were jumping with incredible lightness and speed. I looked back at the child and found that he was still standing in place, staring at me. The strange thing was that the rest of the people didn't seem to notice my presence, as if I wasn't there at all. I began to observe their faces, and I noticed that they looked exactly like the face of the child who had been staring at me, but their bodies were larger, like those of adults. I felt a little reassured because the place was filled with people, and I decided to take a picture to prove to my friends that the village was not abandoned. I took out my phone and started filming, but when I looked at the screen, it was completely black and nothing showed up, even though I could clearly see the fire, the people, and the dancers in front of me. I thought there was a problem with the phone, so I tried adjusting the camera, and when I pointed it to the ground, everything appeared clearly. But as soon as I turned the camera back towards them, everything disappeared. Fear began to creep into me, and I focused more on the people around the fire. I noticed something very strange. Their feet were not normal. They had no toes, and they looked more like black crutches. I felt a strong urge to see things clearly, so I turned on the flashlight. Suddenly, as if a storm of dust had struck my face, I felt something like sand entering my eyes. I heard a loud sound like a puff of air, as if something had deliberately tried to blind me. I started rubbing my eyes, took some water from my bag, and washed my face. When I opened my eyes, the shock was overwhelming. There was no one there. The fire had disappeared, the people had vanished, and I found myself on the edge of a mountain. Had I taken one more step, I would have fallen. It was then that I realized what I had seen wasn't human, but rather demons. I felt an intense fear and decided to immediately return to my spot to spend the rest of the night there, hoping this day would end and I would conquer the challenge. He says, "As I was walking, I illuminated my path with the flashlight, glancing to the right and left. Suddenly, I was shocked to see a man from a distance, dressed entirely in white. Even his skin was white, sitting by the side without turning towards me or looking at me. I felt a chill of fear and immediately turned off the flashlight, for his features were terrifying, and the place was lit only by the moonlight. I tried to quietly move backward to avoid being noticed, hiding behind one of the houses to watch him from a distance, my heart almost stopping from fear. While I was observing him, I suddenly felt a hand grab my shoulder and pull me back. I screamed loudly and spun around in panic, but I saw no one. It was clear that something had pulled me, but there was no one around me. A feeling of horror overcame me, and I felt my hair stand on end. My lips went numb with fear. I got up and began walking aimlessly until I found a nearby house. I entered the house quickly, but as soon as I entered, I heard movement inside, as if something had been there and fled as I entered. I couldn't stay inside, so I immediately climbed to the roof, shaking with fear. I took out my phone to call my friends to come rescue me, but to my shock, the phone was off and not working. I tried to turn it on in vain, realizing that I had placed myself in a situation that could cost me my life from sheer terror, or that something would harm me. I sat on the roof, stunned, and began praying to God that this night would pass without harm. The darkness was complete, and all that could be heard was the sound of the gentle wind. Suddenly I heard a horrifying scream, one that was neither human nor animal, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. The scream grew more terrifying, then stopped suddenly. I turned around, terrified, and the small child I had seen earlier appeared in front of me in an instant. I shone the flashlight towards him, but he stared at me with satanic eyes that sent chills to the heart. What made the situation even more horrifying was that he began to speak, but with the voice of an adult man, a harsh and terrifying voice, and said to me, "Leave this place before dawn, or we will hurt you." I felt helpless and paralyzed, unable to respond to him. I remained frozen in place, watching him turn his back on me and walk away until he disappeared. After that threat, I couldn't stay any longer, so I decided to leave the place immediately. As I was leaving the village, I heard a woman screaming loudly, filled with terror. I didn't know where I was going. All I wanted was to escape this place by any means. I ran without stopping, not knowing where to go, until I reached the edge of the mountain. There, I faced a deep chasm, and there was no way to pass. I was too frightened to go back into the village, so I decided to stay at the edge of the mountain until morning. I sat there, terrified, listening from afar to the sounds of laughter and screams coming from the village. It felt as though the night would never end, and that night was one of the worst experiences of my life, all because of a senseless challenge. I didn't know how much time had passed as my phone was broken and I had no watch. I was watching the village from a distance when I saw things that were unbelievable. I saw people with extremely pale features entering and leaving the village through the cliff, as if they were moving between two worlds. It was then that I realized they were not human. They were demons. What made the situation even more terrifying was that I saw the child who had threatened me leaving the village and heading towards me. He was slowly approaching, wearing a horrifying smile, until I felt as though my soul was about to leave my body from sheer terror. The closer he got, the more I looked at the chasm before me and thought that perhaps I would throw myself into it rather than fall into the hands of this strange child. Little by little, as that child got closer, I felt unable to speak. Fear took hold of me to the point where I screamed loudly, then lost consciousness and collapsed where I stood. I didn't feel anything until I woke up to the light of the sun. When I regained consciousness, I looked at myself and found that I was covered in dust, my clothes in a pitiful state. I had only one choice before me: to leave that village. I put my trust in God and began walking. I looked at the houses around me, unable to believe that I had been there alone the night before. I kept walking until I found another path to leave. I descended the mountain, exhausted, until I reached my friends at around 11 a.m. When they saw me, they started laughing at me. I didn't say a word to them. I got into the car in silence while they tried to talk to me, but I couldn't speak. I simply said, "Please, take me home." And indeed, they took me home. When I arrived, I felt an immense fatigue and immediately fell asleep. While I was asleep, I saw the same child in a dream. This time, he was threatening me, saying, "We will hurt you in your home if you return to the village." I woke up in a state of terror, and it was close to 4 p.m. I went straight to my friends who had dared me to enter that village. I was in a completely different state, as though I had aged 30 years in one night. When they saw me, they began mocking and asking, "Did you take any photos?" I looked at them and said, "Now I understand why the villagers left their homes. I swear, it's haunted by a tribe of demons. What I saw would make your hair turn white." I told them what had happened to me and said, if it weren't for God granting me a strong heart to endure that, I would have died from sheer terror. Since that night, I abandoned recklessness and excessive philosophy, and I began to pray and draw closer to God. But what happened to me didn't end that night. Due to the horror I experienced, I developed diabetes. I became dependent on insulin injections. This was my story with my friends who dared me to get that gun. I used to say at first, there is no such thing as demons. But what happened to me taught me a lesson I will never forget. In the end, I thank God for my safety. I hope everyone avoids such challenges and dangerous adventures. Do not harm yourselves or your loved ones for things that are of no value. Sadly, many people engage in such activities just for views. By the way, one of my friends told me that most of the people in Thai's governorate are aware of that abandoned village in the mountain, and it is said to still be haunted by demons to this day. With that, we come to the end of today's story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel to get all the latest updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.